Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en Paths, donde buscamos desafiarte a entender y defender tu fe cristiana ante un mundo que constantemente la rechaza. El día de hoy abordaremos un tema muy especial y muy controversial. Estaremos conversando sobre un tema que probablemente destape toda una caja de Pandora. Me refiero a uno de los pasajes más controversiales de la Biblia. Sí, me estoy refiriendo al famoso Génesis 1. Antes de entrar en el tema, quiero aclarar que como ministerio, Fe Razonable no está casado con una posición en particular sobre este tema. La posición oficial del Dr. Craig es que Génesis 1 al 11 es mito-historia. Es decir, es un relato histórico que realmente sucedió con personajes reales, pero que está revestido en un lenguaje mitológico y figurativo. Y tenemos que tener mucho cuidado con estos términos, pues no significan exactamente lo que cotidianamente creemos que significan. El Dr. Craig usa este término mitológico, mitología, en un término, en un concepto académico, como lo hace la erudición del Antiguo Testamento. Y de hecho estamos muy emocionados de esto, porque en septiembre de este año, 2021, esperamos que el libro del Dr. Craig, donde publica su investigación sobre el Adán histórico que ha hecho durante alrededor de los últimos 2 o 3 años, va a ser liberado al público, y creemos que, al menos hay rumores, que el libro se va a publicar también en español en las mismas fechas. Hay una editorial, creo que está buscando poder traducirlo. No hay nada oficial, pero esperamos que esto realmente suceda. Aunque la perspectiva que hoy abordaremos con Michael Jones no es compartida por el Dr. Craig ni todos los directores de Fe Razonable, es importante que estemos actualizados y familiarizados con otros puntos de vista en este tema. Michael es probablemente uno de los mejores youtubers cristianos actualmente. Es un buen amigo y es todo un crack en los debates, si es que lo han visto debatir con no creyentes y de todo tipo. Aparte de Ben Stanhope, quien es un académico de las culturas y lenguas semíticas del antiguo Oriente Próximo, Michael es uno de los youtubers que mejor investigación hace en temas relevantes a la Biblia y la apologética cristiana. Y además lo hace de manera accesible, entretenida y bien sustancial a través de su canal de YouTube Inspiring Philosophy, que actualmente tiene más de 200,000 seguidores. Actualmente Michael está estudiando una maestría en filosofía de la Universidad de Arizona y pues nos compartió un poco de su tiempo para expandir sobre esta idea que él ha hecho en una serie de videos de YouTube, que es su serie de Génesis, donde aborda los temas de Génesis 1 al 11. Él, Antonio y yo estaremos discutiendo sobre una perspectiva conocida como la inauguración del templo cósmico, que en pocas palabras es Dios asignando funciones a lo creado para que todo funcione, el universo entero se convierta en el templo cósmico donde Él descansa, donde Él habita y coexiste con los seres humanos. Quiero dejar muy en claro que no creemos que este tema deba ser causa de división ni agresividad entre los cristianos. Creemos que el texto bíblico es al menos flexible en permitir una cantidad de interpretaciones en las que los cristianos realmente podemos diferir. Mas no obstante, todos seguimos siendo parte de la iglesia y somos hermanos y hermanas en la salvación de nuestro Señor Jesucristo. Esperamos que disfrutes mucho esta entrevista y hasta pronto. Hey Michael, thank you for being here. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to hear that you were available for this interview, because this topic it opens a can of worms, right? I know that in my experience, I've faced a lot of pushback when I try to discuss these topics, and I know you have as well, right?
Yeah, I have faced a lot of pushback from this topic, especially among Christians of the evangelical type.
Yeah, indeed. It's the same thing here in Latin America. Being a reasonable faith chapter director, my focus mainly is on natural theology, basic cultural Christian apologetics. But this subject, I mean, I find it really interesting. It's more like a hobby to me, but I know that you've dedicated a lot of time into this. And that's why we have you here.
Yeah, I've dedicated a lot of time because a lot of people don't understand it, and it becomes a major stumbling block for young Christians who are being confronted with evolution and a lot of secular resources, specifically atheists trying to use evolution to deconvert people.
Yeah, indeed. I was researching Gen Z last year, and one of the major objections that people in high school and in college had, uh, or one of the major reasons why they left the faith, was because they thought that science and religion contradicted each other. And one of the subjects was creation and evolution and the interpretation of Genesis 1.
Yeah, that
So,
can be a huge issue.
definitely. So let's tackle this topic. Uh, let's start with, I guess, one of the first videos that you published a while ago. 3 years you published this video on creation and evolution, and there you discuss the idea if a Christian is obligated to reject biological evolution if they believe in the Bible, in Genesis, the inerrancy of the Bible, or something like that. Is that so? Must a Christian reject evolution if they believe that the Bible is true?
No, one of the reasons people think that, and the reason I published the video, is because they have a misunderstanding of what evolution is. A lot of people in the church believe that evolution is a random process that is not guided. It's just blindly a blind process that sort of has produced humans and all sorts of other species. So Christians believe that's what evolution is stating. And then they think, well, that's incompatible with a theistic or a Christian worldview. But that's one view, that's one philosophical interpretation of evolution. That would be more compatible with a neo-Darwinian outlook. But there's other ideas in evolution. There's other ways evolution can happen. There's an idea called structuralism, and this is the idea that the universe was imbued with natural laws to bring about certain life forms. So if you were to rewind the tape of life and start over, on structuralism, you would get human life again, or something very similar. If you started over again and try to redo evolution, you get human life again, or something similar. And the idea is that it's not so random. What the results we got was just not the result of blind chance. Is that certain structures, morphologies, forms were imbued within the natural laws of the universe to bring about certain life forms. And if you have that view of evolution, that's very much compatible with a theistic worldview, because God could have created the universe in a certain way to bring about humans eventually.
I see. Well, that's really important because mainly when I discuss these subjects on creation, evolution, most younger creationists, our brothers and sisters, usually they attack this neo-Darwinian paradigm, and that's the main focus. And for me, at least, I don't know why that is, because as you mentioned, there's other paradigms, other ways to understand evolution, and this is a personal experience. It's been like 4 or 3 times that I've asked a younger creationist if he knows what process structuralism is, because I don't care their objections to neo-Darwinism. I might reject it, uh, but I've asked them, hey, okay, so you reject neo-Darwinism, that's fine. Then what do you think about process structuralism, as you mentioned? And usually they don't answer, or they just resort back to their objections to neo-Darwinism. Has that been your experience as well?
Correct. I think that has been my experience. It's that they attack neo-Darwinism, which is also referred to as the modern synthesis. And it was a synthesis of Darwinian evolution with Mendel's genetics. So this was about 100 years ago or so. But we've moved past that. A lot of what is in the modern synthesis is still used in a lot of modern evolutionary theory, but it's like one piece of a much larger picture. A lot of biologists now refer to an extended evolutionary synthesis. And they'll include ideas from like evo-devo, horizontal gene transfer, epigenetics, of course, all among many other things. And the basic idea is that we don't just look at evolution from a neo-Darwinian standpoint anymore. Excuse me. It's gotten much broader. Our understanding of evolution has gotten much broader. And with that has come a lot of ideas with structuralism, that maybe a lot of what we see in our evolutionary history was fine-tuned by the laws of nature. So when an organism enters a certain ecological niche, a certain environment, there are certain features in the environment that constrain it to go a certain way. And I can give you an example. If you take a look at a shark and an ancient dinosaur called an ichthyosaurus, as well as a dolphin, you're going to notice they all kind of look the same. They all have a fin on top. They have fins on the side. They're all very slim and slender. And the basic idea is when an organism moves into a water-type environment and becomes somewhat of a predator, the environment sort of morphs them to enter a certain morphological form, so to speak. So they all sort of start to look that certain way. And so what the basic point was is that, well, maybe environments fine-tune animals to go along certain paths, and so that there's only a limited number of ways evolution could actually happen. And that would imply physical laws or environments fine-tune organisms to be a certain way. Instead of it all being very random, uncontrolled, you can get anything you want kind of thing. It may not actually be that way.
Wow, really, really good. Now, you mentioned a term there that it's really interesting, fine-tuning. If this process structuralism view of evolution turns out to be true, then would we say that it improves or builds upon the fine-tuning argument, like the one that Dr. Craig and Luke Barnes and all of those guys present? Or is it completely unrelated?
No, I feel like it could. So the fine-tuning argument is arguing from the physical constraints on the universe, the initial conditions of the universe kind of thing, the current expansion of the universe. So yeah, that's all really great because it shows that we need certain physical parameters to be fine-tuned a certain way for life to even exist. But now we can add on top of that there might be physical laws that have not only made it capable for life to exist, but may have constrained the evolution of life to only go down certain paths. So it can be an addition to that argument. I wouldn't use it by itself, but I could use it in addition to the standard fine-tuning argument.
Okay, cool. Antonio, ¿quieres preguntar algo?
Sí, porque justamente va relacionado, no sé si lo comentaste, pero igual aquí en Latinoamérica se reduce toda la cuestión de la evolución al sentido del neodarwinismo. Entonces, una pregunta interesante sería, ¿qué autores recomiendas para informarnos más acerca de esta visión distinta de la teoría evolutiva?
Yeah. Sorry, I was grabbing this book. This would be a good book, I would say. Some of the chapters are kind of complex, I would say that. But each chapter has a different author. So you get all these different perspectives. So that's a pretty good book. As I said, some of the chapters can be a little complex.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is Fitness of the Cosmos for Life.
Fitness of the Cosmos for Life. Okay.
Yes. So that's the book. Another good one, what might be The Runes of Evolution by Simon Conway Morris. And what that book is he goes through all these different examples of convergence that has happened. So different forms, like I talked about with the dolphins and the sharks, evolving to have similar forms. It's basically an encyclopedia of all these different forms that have converged to the same thing in evolutionary theory. Another good book might be Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis by Michael Denton. That's another good book on structuralism. He may be go a little too far. He may be more of a structuralist than I myself am, but I still think it's a pretty good book.
Okay. Well, something that you mentioned now that bringing it back to the dolphins, I heard of our young and earth creationist brothers that they say that similar structures are evidence for a similar creator or a similar designer. Uh, I mean, it might be, but I don't think that argument is really strong or point. It really doesn't conclude on anything. What are your thoughts on what they say?
Yeah, it's a interesting argument. I don't think it works because when you look at the genetics, it wouldn't really cohere with a designer because we have a lot of things in our genes called fossil genes. So, for example, you and I and most other primates, great apes, can have something in our genes that could synthesize vitamin C. So we wouldn't need to get vitamin C from a food source. Because of this gene, our bodies could just make it naturally. We have that gene in our DNA. It's still there, but it doesn't work. Why would a designer put that in our DNA? That would not cohere with design. That would cohere with we had an ancient ancestor before the great apes that could synthesize vitamin C. And then they lost that gene, or they lost that ability as they moved into more vegetative areas, and they were getting it from fruit almost daily, like our ancestors did. So that would cohere more with an evolutionary theory. Sure, you could say similar structures or evidence of design, but you don't need to jump to the idea that a god had to just supernaturally create all the species. Why not say God just simply designed things through a process of evolution, like a structuralist account? It doesn't really support the notion of supernatural sudden creation and everything was just designed as it is. Because you could just say, well, there was a God who designed through evolutionary theory. So sure, you could explain it that way, but it's not necessary. And there's nothing to favor that sort of interpretation of the similar structures.
Quizás una pregunta ahí, porque también es otra objeción parecida respecto al deísmo, ¿no? O quizás esta noción de un creador que hizo todo con las leyes físicas para que funcione y se aparta. ¿Qué responderías a eso?
Okay. Now, another objection that might come up, I don't know if it would come up from a young earth creationist or even atheists, that saying that, well, okay, this just implies some sort of deism, this supernatural being, this God that created stuff, created the universe with the laws of physics and chemistry, and then just took his hands out and walked away. Would you say, what would you respond to this kind of argument?
Yeah, you could make that same argument from intelligent design. A god or a deistic God just sort of designed everything supernaturally and then walked away. Intelligent design evolution doesn't really point to a specific religion. Arguments from natural theology don't point to a specific religion. So that wouldn't really be an issue because anyone arguing from intelligent design or young earth creationism could even argue that it's compatible with deism. A god could have just designed the earth 6,000 years ago and walked away. I mean, that doesn't really tell us either way.
Yeah, it's like picking holes in something that the argument doesn't intend to prove, right?
Right, and even intelligent design advocates will note their theory does not point to a god. If you read their actual literature, they'll say it could be intelligent, a life on this planet could have been intelligently designed by aliens, by some sort of natural god like Zeus or Thor. They never say this proves the God of natural theology or the God of Christianity.
Antonio, do you have any other comment?
Sí, bueno, una vez quizás ya para pasar de tema, porque ya discutimos tus ideas acerca de la evolución y el tema que nos compete aquí es el texto de Génesis 1. Algunos dirán, ok, Michael está de acuerdo con la teoría evolutiva, entonces, por ende, trata de forzar el texto de Génesis 1, de modo tal que la teoría evolutiva quepa ahí. ¿Es eso lo que estás tratando de hacer? ¿Tú forzas el texto para que la teoría evolutiva sea verdad?
Well, no, because when we talk about Genesis, we don't even talk about evolution. You look at my series on Genesis 1 to 11, I never mention evolution. What we're trying to do is trying to understand what the text would have meant to an ancient author or to an ancient audience. We're not trying to make it fit with an evolutionary worldview. We want to understand what it would have meant to the ancient author. And the ancient author would not have had any ideas about evolution, quantum mechanics, or any sort of modern scientific theory. They were more focused on things important to them, things like functions, order, who was really the head god, who was really running the universe. That's what was important to them. So those are the kind of questions they were asking. And so the point the theistic evolution is making is when you study Genesis in its ancient cultural context, it doesn't say either way if evolution is true or not, because it's a completely different subject. They're doing completely different things.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that we need to understand Genesis in its historical and cultural context. What would you say to the argument that, because I saw this yesterday in a video, somebody saying, but if you give your Bible, Genesis 1, to a 10-year-old and read it and then ask them what would they understand, and they would say, they would come up obviously with a young earth creationist understanding. Does that modify or affect this position, the way that we understand the Bible?
No, because the Bible was not written in English, and it was never meant to be interpreted by 10-year-olds. That doesn't make any sense. The Bible was written by prophets in Israel who had training, and then it was handed down to the people to be understood in its cultural context. They didn't give it to 10-year-olds and go, how would you understand this, 10-year-old? Great, that's now how we understand it. That's absurd. So no, that is not a good argument. As I said, it wasn't written in English, it was written in Hebrew. So we should try to understand it in its ancient language as well as its ancient cultural context. Just because we can read an English translation and take a surface reading, that doesn't mean that is exactly what the ancient author was trying to get at. For example, in Genesis 8, it says God opened the windows of heaven or closed the windows of heaven to stop it from raining. Okay, a 10-year-old might actually think there are windows in the sky or something.
Yeah.
But that's not accurate. So we don't need to look at it like that. We should try to understand it in a cultural context, not just a surface understanding, not just a simplistic understanding. The Bible is a very complicated book filled with a lot of theological truth that takes years for some scholars to fully understand. We should treat it like that, like it's a complex book filled with endless revelation that we're always going to get something new from.
Wow, pretty good. Now, you mentioned, and I've watched your Genesis video series. In a nutshell, can you give us a description of how you understand Genesis 1?
Yeah. So the way I understand Genesis 1 is I understand it as more of a temple inauguration account. So basically, God is sort of electing the cosmos to be his new temple. He is now going to reign in the cosmos with humans and with all of creation. This is where he's going to make his home. He's going to reign with creation, and this will be his temple. So Genesis 1 is basically a 7-day temple inauguration. He is transforming the cosmos into his temple.
Okay, Antonio?
Bueno, quizás alguna noción que para algunos se les dificulta, ¿no? Creo que John Lennox menciona algo así en su libro de El principio según el Génesis y la ciencia, ¿no? Y menciona algunas objeciones y muchos otros. Principalmente respecto a esta visión de la inauguración del templo cósmico, algunas otras referencias en el Antiguo Testamento puede haber, o esta es la única referencia en Génesis 1. Para muchos quizás sea muy importante, ¿no? Saber si esta es una continuidad en el pensamiento a lo largo del Antiguo Testamento o se limita a Génesis 1.
Okay, that's a good question. Others have objective, including John Lennox and other, well, I wouldn't say scholars because John Lennox is not a scholar in the Old Testament, but the point being that, is there any other reference in the Old Testament to this understanding of Genesis 1 as temple inauguration? Because we would expect that there's a continuity between how the ancient Israelites understand Genesis 1, the creation account. So is there any other references in other book, or maybe even outside the Bible, but from the ancient Israelites, how they understand this cosmic temple inauguration?
So specifically, with regards to that, we have to remember that the ancient culture was a high context society. They didn't really add a lot of commentary like we want today. So like we want to add footnotes, endnotes, references. We're a low context culture because we add as much context into the text as possible. In high context societies, like ancient Israel, that was more or less within their own cultural understanding, and they didn't feel it necessary to imbue a lot of that in the text. So we need to keep that in mind. With regards to the creation, a lot of scholars, for example, would note, for example, Psalm 74. It seems to be another creation account, but it's kind of different from what we read in Genesis 1. It's more about God taming this chaos creature called the Leviathan and keeping him down. Now, there is one possible place where they do seem to think that maybe Genesis, for example, 1 is not necessarily about creating all matter and space-time from nothing. It's in Jeremiah 4, and Jeremiah takes a lot of themes we see in the creation account, and he talks about how the northern kingdom of Israel has sort of dissolved. It's become nothing. And he says it's become tohu and bohu, formless and void. There's no men anymore. There's no birds of the air. There's no vegetation. There's no light. And so he's kind of doing a reverse of what you read in Genesis 1. But we know when the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed, the fabric of space-time didn't open up and the kingdom was sucked out. No, we think it just went from a functioning kingdom to a non-functioning kingdom. Well, if the reverse language is being used in Genesis 1, it implies that what's happening there is God is taking a non-functioning cosmos and making it function properly to be his temple. And the 7-day motif you actually can find in scripture. So, for example, the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus 40 was completed in 7 stages. In Leviticus 8, the ordination of a priest has to take 7 days. Solomon's temple was constructed in 7 years. It was dedicated to God during a 7-day festival in 1 Kings 8. And Solomon's dedication speech is even given in 7 petitions. So this idea that temples were sort of like religious practices were divided into 7 parts is pretty common in Israelite literature. So if God is turning the cosmos into his temple, we would expect him to be doing a very similar thing in Genesis 1.
Wow. There's so many things that we want to pick from that, but I want to focus first on the function mentioned that you are referencing in Genesis 1. What exactly does that mean? Because I'm getting the idea that you believe that the text doesn't imply that there's material creation, and that is like a huge bomb for our audience right now. Could you clarify on that? What does it mean, material creation, function creation, and why should we believe function creation in Genesis 1?
Well, for one thing, a lot of scholars like J. Richard Middleton and John Walton have argued that this is what is actually happening in the text. It's not about material creation. It's about God making things function properly. So look at verse 14. God says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens." The verse doesn't stop there, though. It continues. It says, "To separate the day from the night, to let them be signs and for seasons and for days and for years." So the point of the verse is there needs to be lights there to function for seasons, for signs, to mark days and years. Okay, well, it's pointing out what the functions of these lights are, the sun and the moon. When it says the earth was formless and void, the words there are tohu and bohu. But scholar David Samuro has pointed out that that probably isn't what it means. It most likely means something like not functioning properly or being unproductive. So the earth was unproductive and waste. And then God makes it be productive. That's what the rest of the chapter is about, God making it be productive. Now that says God, let there be light, but I mean, read that in context of Jeremiah 4. Moving light just means something is not functioning properly. So in Genesis 1, it could just mean the light now means God is showing up to make things function properly. So there's a lot of that. The earth in verse 11 its function is to sprout forth vegetation and plants. So it's about God pointing out the functions of certain things, how they're going to operate within his cosmos. Now, I'm not saying there is no place in the Bible where it doesn't say God created everything. It's in John 1 verse 3, Colossians 1:16 as well. So there are places where it does say God created all matter. My point is that's not what really Genesis 1 is about. Why? Well, that's not what the ancient authors cared about. A lot of people in the ancient Near East didn't care about where matter, space, or time came from. They assumed those things were just already there. And so they weren't asking those same questions.
Okay. Antonio, you want to add something?
Sí, porque esto es una cuestión importante, porque algunos creen que la interpretación del templo cósmico excluye quizás hasta la doctrina de ex nihilo o esta noción de la creación material, ¿no? Creer que Dios no creó la materia. Entonces, pero una perspectiva, bueno, una pregunta que tengo sería si tú sostienes la doctrina de ex nihilo. Digo, John Walton la sostiene, más por referencias al Nuevo Testamento, pero quizás saber si Michael sostiene esta doctrina.
Mm-hmm. Here we have two questions. First of all, and I think you already referenced this, do you believe in creation ex nihilo? And this would be my question, on the basis of what do you believe creation is ex nihilo? Do you believe it exclusively because the New Testament teaches it and deals with it? Or is there any other reference in the Old Testament that we might take as creation ex nihilo?
There might be a place in Proverbs, but I can't remember where it is. But no, I think it's mostly going to be in the New Testament. Because again, in the ancient Near East, they weren't focused on those questions. Now, in the New Testament, you're writing in a post-Aristotelian world, post-Aristotle. And people were more interested in terms of substance and form, matter, these types of things. Earlier Greek philosophers were like Thales or Heraclitus were trying to question what everything was made of. So you have those questions in the cultural environment when the New Testament is being written. So questions about creation ex nihilo, these would have been more on the minds of the New Testament authors. I would say, when God talks about in Hebrews 11, he's talking about God creating everything by his word. So that would be very coherent with my view.
Okay. So, to my understanding, it is almost universally accepted that John 1 is drawing from Genesis 1, especially because the first sentence of the gospel in the beginning matches with Genesis 1. Do you think this is the case? And how would our interpretation of John 1, if we take it in a functional cosmic temple inauguration view, be changed, or shouldn't it be changed at all?
No, I don't think it'll be changed. We have to remember a lot of times New Testament authors are taking stuff in the Old Testament and reworking it in very important ways. So go to Ephesians 5. Paul there quotes Genesis 2. He's talking about, the two shall become one flesh. But he says, actually, this mystery, this becoming one flesh, this is about Christ and the church in verse 32. Okay, well, the ancient author of Genesis 2 was probably not talking about Christ and the church. Paul is taking that and he's applying additional meaning to it in Ephesians 5. So just because a New Testament author takes an Old Testament passage, that doesn't mean that's what the Old Testament passage meant in its cultural context. And that doesn't mean that now then we have to interpret that Old Testament passage entirely in the New Testament meaning. In Ephesians 5, Paul is just sort of taking an Old Testament passage and he's applying it in a secondary way, in this new way. So yeah, in John 1, he's definitely sort of echoing Genesis 1. Interestingly enough, though, there's no definite article in Genesis 1 or John 1:1. So there's no in the beginning in either of those. That we add the word the there because it's easier for us to read in English, but it's not in John 1. But he's sort of just taking it and he's sort of reworking it and applying and just pointing out Jesus is the beginning of everything. He created everything. But just because New Testament authors apply a double meaning to something, that doesn't mean the original was meant to do that. They were being guided by the Holy Spirit to add secondary meaning to certain passages. And John Walton talks about this in his Lost World series.
I see. Well, I want to ask a question, and then we can, I guess, move on to the 7-day motif that you mentioned before. But I guess this opens a can of worms on its own. And what would be the correct translation of Genesis 1:1? I know that you've dealt this in your videos, and this was like mind blowing for me when I read about this, and I read Ben Stanhope on that. What do you have to say about that?
Right. So my basic view is that it should be, when you read Genesis 1:1, what you read is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But a lot of scholars like Robert D. Homestead and Ben Stanhope have pointed out that's probably not what it means. Even in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible, the vowel points they added does not imply it should mean in the beginning. What it should actually be translated as is when God began to create the heavens and the earth. This is also in Robert Alter's new translation he put out. He's a Hebrew scholar, and he's been working on translating the Old Testament for decades. In his translation, he says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Why? Well, because it lacks a definite article in the Hebrew. And Robert Homestead, for example, he found undiscovered grammatic laws in Hebrew that would also constrain this and force this interpretation. So what that does is it turns Genesis 1:1 into an incomplete sentence. If I said, this morning I woke up. Okay, well, that was a complete sentence. But if I said, when I woke up this morning, well, that's not a complete sentence. You would expect me to finish it. When I woke up this morning, I did X, Y, and Z thing. So it turns Genesis 1:1 into an incomplete sentence. That makes it dependent on Genesis 1:2. So really what they're saying in Genesis 1 and 1:2 is not, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. What they're saying is, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void, or unproductive and waste. So that implies God sort of shows up at a point in time to the earth when it's unproductive, waste, formless, void, however you want to translate that, and then he begins to make it function properly.
Wow, cool. Antonio, do you want to add something there? No? Okay. Now, before, I guess I have another question here, because I think it's also important to mention. With respect to the functions, you mentioned that these are in a human society, right? It's not about their function in, for example, when we're talking about the sun, it's just not that God is assigning a function to tell this kind of object, hey, you're now going to burn for 10,000 years, right? It's how they're going to function in a human society, right?
Right, and that's what a lot of critics of John Walton have gotten wrong. They think it's regarding their physical functioning. And so a lot of replies I've seen from John Walton have been based their reply on this misunderstanding, and it just hasn't worked when they try to refute him.
I see. Now, in the days of Genesis 1, we see this kind of, I don't know how to say, structure, like you create in one day. I don't remember right now the structure, but in one day you create the sun and the moon, and then you create the heavens for them to inhabit them. In another day you create the land and the seas, and then its parallel is the land animals and the sea animals, right? Could you elaborate on that?
Right. So people read the days in Genesis 1 as chronological. Day 1, then day 2, then day 3, then day 4, and so on. The problem is, that doesn't really work, because you have plants created on day 3, and then the sun and the moon created on day 4. Well, what was keeping the plants alive before that? Also, days, nights, evenings, and mornings, they're marked by the earth going around the sun. how could there have been day, evening, and morning if there was no sun until day 4? What was causing evening if there was no sunset? What was causing the morning if there was no sunrise? That doesn't make a lot of sense. The truth is, the ancient authors were not writing in chronological order. They were writing symmetrically. So on day 1, you got the lights. On day 4, you got the luminaries, the sun and the moon. Day 2, you have sky and sea. On day 5, you have the animals that inhabit the sky and the sea. Day 3, you have the land and the plants. And on day 6, you have the animals that inhabit the land. They're being symmetrical. Day 1 correlates with day 4, day 2 with 5, and 3 with 6. They're not trying to write in chronological order. They're trying to write symmetrically. You have 7 days, and then you have the 6 days of creation, and you have 2 sets. So 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6, and it's supposed to be symmetrical going across. So a lot of modern readers miss that, and we want to force our modern expectation of chronology onto the text. That's not what the ancient authors were doing.
Okay, cool. Antonio, anything you want to add there? Good. Okay.
Sí,
Now,
quizás, perdón. Bueno, tiene que ver con lo que mencionaba acerca de, sobre todo la cláusula dependiente de Génesis 1,
okay.
porque históricamente se ha leído como una cláusula independiente, y algunos argumentan que hasta los padres de la iglesia así lo interpretaron. ¿Qué respondería él acerca de esto, acerca de la interpretación histórica de la cláusula independiente? Si tiene que ver también con los nuevos descubrimientos de manuscritos, etc.
Right. So the way to respond to this is to point out that today we have gotten far more context from the ancient Near East and from ancient Israel. So a lot of the church fathers didn't have the massive libraries we have. They couldn't read Sumerian. They couldn't read Egyptian. They lost, a lot of the ancient texts, archaeological finds that we have today were lost. So we have far better context than what they had in the ancient world. And so for example, when the King James was being translated, there were so many words in the Greek New Testament that we didn't have in any other ancient Greek work. I think there was about 500 words in the Greek New Testament that we couldn't find in any other ancient work. So we thought, well, maybe the New Testament authors invented some sort of like new language or new words to explain what they were getting at. Now, since we've been able to study more of the ancient world, there's only about 50 words or so that are found in the New Testament that are not found in other ancient Greek works. So we're getting far more context from the ancient world than what we had in prior centuries. Likewise, we were able to cipher Egyptian. We've discovered like lost archives, like what we found at Mari or Ebla, these ancient lost cities and whatnot. So we've been able to learn more about ancient similar languages like Akkadian, Ugaritic, and all sorts of other ancient cultures of the ancient Near East. So that has also shaped our understanding of Hebrew, because Hebrew is an amalgam of a lot of ancient languages like Egyptian, Ugaritic, Akkadian, and whatnot. It borrows from a lot of other languages. This has helped us better to understand Hebrew, and that's why a lot of what we're doing now is giving us a better understanding of the Bible. The golden age for biblical interpretation is now. It wasn't when John Calvin was around. It wasn't when St. Augustine was around. It's now.
Wow. Now, that is really, I guess, controversial. I was going to say radical, but no, controversial. Because, and I've had people said this to me, and I would like to hear what you have, your thoughts on that. That sounds pretty arrogant, right? How dare we say that we have a better interpretation than the church fathers, than the reformers? Because apparently, and I've heard this line of argumentation, because they interpret it that way, this is a historical view of the church, we must remain with that. But as you mentioned, if we have better discoveries, better evidence, a greater understanding of the biblical text, why not correct ourselves, right?
Right. I mean, we wouldn't want to stick to the medical advice of 500 or 1,000 years ago. Medicine evolves and it gets better. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Same with biblical interpretation. I'm not saying Augustine or John Calvin is useless. I'm saying we have more context in them. We can use them and other stuff they didn't have to better understand the text. So the only reason we're doing better than them is because we came after them. We're able to use what they had and then more.
Wow. Okay. Nice response. Now, I want to go back a little bit because you mentioned something that I believe some would encounter really unsettling, and that is you kind of compared, and you did this on your videos as well. You compared the text of Genesis 1 with other ancient Near Eastern pagan myths. Is this true? Is there an actual parallel between Genesis 1 and other creation accounts?
I would say no. I don't think there's a parallel in that strong sense. The only thing I say is a parallel is structure. So they sort of are structured in a similar way. So they start with a dependent clause, followed by a circumstantial clause, followed by the main clause. That's also how Genesis 2 starts. Now, Genesis 2 really starts in Genesis 2:4. That's really when the chapter, scholars will note that's really when the chapter begins. So it starts with a dependent clause. When the Lord God, so it starts with when again, when Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And he goes on to the circumstantial clause, when there was no bush in the field yet in the land, and no small plant of the field yet sprung up, etc., etc. Then the main clause, then the Lord God formed the man of the dust from the ground and breathed into his life. Same thing happens in Genesis 1. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, dependent clause, followed by circumstantial clause. The earth was unproductive and waste, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and a wind of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Main clause. And then God said, let there be light. This is what we see in other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, like Atrahasis or Enuma Elish. They start with a dependent clause, a circumstantial clause, and a main clause. That's all it. That's just typically the structural way you would open a certain, like a creation account, sort of like this. That's not to say they were borrowing from pagans. That's not to say that they were sort of trying to do polemics against them. There's a debate over that entirely. It just means that's just the structure of how you would do certain things in the ancient past. It's sort of like today, if you were to form a government, you'd probably start with a constitution. And you would have a similar structure. You'd have articles within the Constitution. You'd follow the same structure. That doesn't mean we're copying each other. The French were not copying the Americans when they had their revolution and put forward their own constitution. They had their own ideas they imbued in their constitution, but they followed a similar structure. Likewise, in the ancient Near East, they just follow a similar structure. This is how you do it. It's almost like today, if you're going to write a fairy tale, you're going to start with once upon a time, or long, long time ago, et cetera, et cetera. You're just using similar cultural, structural elements to write these accounts.
Oh, well, thank you for correcting me on that. I thought that was your position, but that's a good clarification. So it's just the structure and the way that frame things, basically. So,
right. I would say Genesis is very unique in the ancient Near East. It's not an amalgam of pagan legends they put together. I think that's a silly idea. And I'm actually going to do a video, I think in September, where I just point out they weren't borrowing from pagans. That's just not how this works.
Okay. Antonio, anything to add there? We're good? Okay. Now, this is a question that I have related to the cosmic temple creation view. And let me see if I can word this out correctly. Because from what I've understood on your videos, you kind of posit a causal or correlation between the 7-day temple inaugurations and the rituals and all of that to the 7-day cosmic temple inauguration in Genesis 1. What would you respond to a younger creationist that says that the causal arrow is pointing the other way around? That is, we have the 7-day motif, the 7-day temple inaugurations, the rituals with the number 7 and all of that, because God revealed to Adam or to Moses or to the patriarchs this 7-day creation week, material creation week? I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah, well, they're only sort of supporting my point. If Genesis 1 was about material creation, why would later authors feel when they need to erect the tabernacle or temple, they should follow a 7-day motif? If it's a completely different thing. You're building a temple, you're not creating matter, or you're not creating a world. So if they're looking to Genesis 1 and going, oh, look how God inaugurated his temple, let's do it the same way, that would support my view that Genesis 1 is really a temple inauguration view. So they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot if they try that.
I see. Okay. Now, just to be clear on that, you do believe that the 7 days in Genesis 1 are literal 24-hour days? Or is that something different?
In a sense, yeah, I do think they're literal 7 24-hour days where God anoints a certain thing or elects a certain thing on this day and then moves to the next one. That's how the ancient authors structured it, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, because I've heard a lot of objections when I bring this out, that we're interpreting the days to fit millions and millions of years to fit evolution into the text. But it's really interesting because, as you mentioned, in just this discussions, it's 30 last minutes, we haven't discussed evolution at all. It's just about the text.
Correct. And this is what a lot of young earth creationists don't get. We're not trying to force evolution into the text. We're trying to understand the text in its ancient Near Eastern context. And when you do that, you go, well, wait a minute. These are completely different things. It's like trying to find calculus in the Bible. You won't find it because they're different subjects altogether. And when you realize that, you realize evolution can be compatible with Christianity, just like Christianity is compatible with calculus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Now, let's go to another subject that it's also going to be mind-blowing. And let's start with this simple question. Were there humans before Adam and Eve? What's your view on that?
I think that's what the Bible says. I think it's pretty clear that's what the Bible says. And my reasoning is this. Take Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. People see in Genesis 1, God creates man and woman. They're not named. It's just he creates humans in Genesis 1. It's very general language. You know, he elects humans to be the image of God, gives them dominion over the earth kind of thing. Now, what happens in Genesis 2 is kind of interesting. In Genesis 2, what you have is something called a toledoth. So in Genesis 2:4, it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Now, typically when that phrase comes up, it comes up a lot in Genesis. It's like, these are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Ishmael. These are the generations of Terah. And when it comes up, it's almost like a chapter marker. It's introducing what comes next. The generations of Ishmael, or the generations of Terah, the generations of Noah, who you name it. So it's introducing what comes after that person. If it's used in Genesis 2, it's also implying what comes after everything that happened in Genesis 1. Adam and Eve don't come after. They don't come until after the toledoth. So that implies all the humans in Genesis 1 were there. And then God elects or creates Adam and Eve in the garden in a special sacred relationship. So all humans, wherever they were in Genesis 1, were elected to be the image of God. Then chapter 2 starts, and he takes two special humans to work and reign in the garden. So that would imply there were already these other humans there before Adam and Eve were elected. Young Earth creationists want to say that Genesis 2 is an elaborate, intricate recap of what happens on day 6. But the toledoth nature doesn't support that. You don't do these exhaustive recounts when you introduce a toledoth. You're going to, if that was it, that should come before the toledoth in Genesis 2:4. It shouldn't come after.
Wow. Okay. Antonio, I have a question, but Antonio, do you like to add something?
Sobre esto no, quizás la siguiente pregunta, pero haz tu pregunta si quieres.
Okay. Well, it's more like a comment because, and maybe I had misunderstood your videos all this time, but I guess the only objection or something that prevented me to fully embrace this view was the Imago Dei, the actual God creating humans in His image, and in my background knowledge was that when God created humans, that he created Adam and Eve, he created them in the imago Dei, the image of God. But then when presented with this idea, and I've seen you discuss this with Joshua Swamidas about there being humans before Adam and Eve, I thought, well, what about the imago Dei? Where does that fit? But you're saying that the imago Dei was established for all humans in Genesis 1, even before Adam and Eve, right?
Right. And Michael Heiser notes that what's actually happening in Genesis 1 with the imago Dei is not like a material creation. It's actually more of an election point. That's the way the grammar would sort of imply it. That's what the grammar implies. So it's about God electing man to be his image, to be his likeness, to be his representatives. It's the exact same thing when Paul says in Romans that we are called to conform to the image of his son. It's about Christ electing us to represent him, to be his image on earth. Likewise, Israel is elected to be God's representative nation on earth. And in Genesis 1, it's the same thing. God is electing humans to be his image on earth. It's not a creation point. To be an image means you're being called to be someone's representative.
Okay. Go ahead. Do you want to add something?
La pregunta, pero ¿quieres tú decir algo?
No.
Ok.
Adelante.
Porque quizás toda esta noción de haber humanos previos a Adán y Eva, para algunos puede ser muy controversial porque hay ciertos pasajes que dan a entender que justamente Adán y Eva son los padres de toda la humanidad. Por ejemplo, Primera de Corintios. ¿Tú qué responderías justamente a esta noción?
Mm-hmm. As we mentioned, this is quite like a bomb dropped on our ears, but because there's certain passages in the Old and in the New Testament that seem to imply, or at least we've been taught, and through generations we've been taught that the first humans were Adam and Eve. And I'm just going to read a couple of those. Obviously, we don't have time to go into an exegetical analysis of each of one, but I want to get your thoughts on this. For example, 1 Corinthians 15, 45 and 47, it says that the first man became a living being, and it was Adam. The first man, Adam, became a living being. And the first man was of the dust of the earth. Acts 17:26 says, from one man he made all nations. And even in Genesis 2:18, it says, then the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. Now, why would God say that man should not be alone if there were other humans with him in the earth, at least?
So Genesis...
Yeah, a lot of that.
Yeah, so Genesis 2 implies that God is taking Adam and putting him in a sacred garden. So he's in and the garden is sort of viewed as the first temple. It's the sacred space that only, and we know about the temple is like in the Holy of Holies, only the priests could enter there. So Adam is this first priest of creation. He's in there by himself. Interestingly enough, Robert Alter notes when it says it's not good for man to be alone, I will make for him a helper. That word for helper is very weird. It typically refers to like a military sustainer. So it's more about like he needs help, and he needs more help in like this sort of this conquest on the earth. Now, why would he need a military sustainer if everything was already perfect and the earth did not need subdued, as Genesis 1 tells us? Problem there for young earth creationists. But so Adam is sort of put in this temple and he's supposed to perform these priestly duties. When he's told to till and take care of the garden, those verbs there are very much religious type activities you would do in this garden environment. So he's alone in this garden performing these religious tasks and he needs help doing it. So he gets a priestess to help him. So a very interesting point there is in the original garden, Adam and Eve, man and woman, they were both priests of creation. It wasn't just men that were priests. In the original way God wanted, he wanted men and women to both be priests in the garden. So the basic idea is that he's alone in this temple environment and he needs a helper, obviously. So that's not a problem for this interpretation. With regards to 1 Corinthians 15, I don't know why young earth creationists use that. someone gave me a book called Adam, Where Are You? And my debate I had in Canada. And they use this verse over and over. It says, Adam was the first man. Adam was the first man. They don't like to read the rest of 1 Corinthians 15, where it says Jesus was the second man, or that he was the last man. Okay, obviously Jesus was not the second created being. That's heresy. So they like to take the first part of that literal, but they don't want to take the second part literal. That's obviously metaphorical. So that doesn't work. With regards to the place in Acts, it says God created all nations by one man. First of all, Stephen is addressing the Jews at that time. And yeah, all the nations at that time would have been descended from Adam and Eve. This is something Joshua Swamidas has shown in his latest book, that everyone today can be descended from Adam and Eve based on understanding of genealogical heritage. I believe the most recent common ancestor of everyone today only lived like 2,000 years ago. And so a lot of times the most recent common ancestor only goes back a couple thousand years. So everyone by that time, based on computer models, would have been descended from Adam and Eve at that point. So it's not an issue either way. That doesn't mean he was the first man. It just refers to all the nations that would have been descended from Adam and Eve at that point. So yeah, none of those verses really imply Adam necessarily has to be the literal first human ever. And again, looking at Genesis 1 with the Toledoth in Genesis 2, I don't think the Bible implies Adam was the first human.
Okay. Well, there's so much to pick on that. Antonio, anything you want to add?
Pues simplemente recalcar el hecho de que, si se fijan, se asume que Adán y Eva son figuras históricas, porque es otro quizás error que se suele tener respecto a una interpretación más funcional, tanto de la creación en Génesis 1 como en el relato de la creación del hombre, como si fueran mitos o alegorías, y se rechaza la historicidad de estos personajes. Simplemente recalcar este punto.
Mm-hmm. So, I guess just to clarify, you do believe, and John Walton also believes, that Adam and Eve were historical figures, right? It's not like they're allegorical or fictional. They were true human beings in the historical sense, right?
Right. We would say they were the first priest and priestess over creation. This is why Jesus is always contrasted with Adam. He was the priest who failed, and Jesus is the priest who succeeded.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Pretty interesting theological point. Now, going more into the details of Adam and Eve, how were they created? Because it says that the text says that God took from the dust of the earth, and for Eve, he took a man's rib. And I've seen pictures and books and cartoons and stuff of God taking a rib or of Adam and creating Eve from that side, and then God kind of patching up after surgery, I guess, that he did to Adam. Does the text say that?
Well, if it does, they're going to have a lot of problems with that. So if you want to take this chapter ultra literally, you're going to have a lot of problems. So take Genesis 2:24. It says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Does that mean Adam and Eve literally became like sewed up together at the side and were walking around as like one body for the rest of their life? No, that's obviously a metaphor. And that's a clue that there might be other metaphors in the chapter. So doesn't actually say rib in Genesis 2. The actual Hebrew word is selah, which means side. It refers to the entire side of someone. It never really means just a rib. That's an English thing or a Spanish thing we've imposed upon the text. If God took Adam's side and closed up the flesh, does that imply that there was a giant chunk of Adam out of him? Was it he cut in half kind of thing? That would be silly. If you want to go ultra literal on this, it says God put Adam into a deep sleep. Now that word for deep sleep is actually a word used in the Bible to refer to someone being prepared for a vision. It's used in other places in the Bible when someone is about to be given a vision. So by that logic, what happens next, if you want to go ultra literal, God is showing Adam a vision that woman is the other side of him, not a rib, the other side of him. And again, it never says Adam woke up. So if you want to be ultra literal, we're still in Adam's dream then by that logic. But of course, that would be kind of ridiculous. But so, no, I don't think it literally says Eve was created from a rib. If you want to go ultra literal, you also have to take the deep sleep aspect ultra literal. And that means God is showing him a vision of what is actually happening. Also, with Adam being created from dust, there is no preposition in that verse. So it doesn't actually say Adam was created from dust. It says God yatsard, that's the verb, God yatsard man, dust of the earth. A lot of scholars note dust of the earth is actually an ancient Near Eastern idiom to refer to mortality. God yatsard created, called, whatever, how you want to translate it, this mortal man, aka dust of the earth. So this is why in Genesis 3, God says, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Okay, Adam literally was not a cloud of dust when God said that to him. It's an idiom to point out that he was mortal and he's going to return and he's going to die. So when God is saying that he is dust of the earth in Genesis 2, it likely refers to his mortality, not what he was made from.
Okay. I had something I was going to comment on that, but I completely forgot. Antonio, do you want to add something there? Any questions? Okay. I guess that the last subject we want to tackle today will be the subject of animal death. And I think you already pointed to that when you mentioned that Eve was going to be this kind of military companion to Adam. Simple question. I imagine a really complicated answer. Were there animal, human, and vegetal death before the fall?
I would say yes. This seems to be what's understood even by early commentators like Philo of Alexandria. So when you hear in Genesis 1, God told man to subdue the earth and have dominion over the fish, the birds, and the animals, those are very harsh words, much harsher than what we have in English. The word dominion usually means oppressive force. Like, you're not going to have this kind of thing, like this kind of dominion, unless you are, unless you're ruling in very harsh or unjust way. Like when it talks about Solomon's dominion, like young earth creationists, for some reason, I brought this passage up to try to combat me on this. Like when it talks about Solomon's dominion ruling over the Philistines, that refers to being very harsh upon them and putting heavy loads and taxation on them. Young earth creationists bring that verse up to me to try to refute me. And I'm like, you should read the passage. So it likely refers, so Joshua John Van E wrote his dissertation called Death in the Garden. And it basically points out this likely refers to the idea that humans are given animals to do whatever they want with. The word for subdue in that passage is also very harsh. It refers to like military conquest or enslaving. So God tells humans, go out and subdue the earth in like a military conquest type fashion. All right, well, that doesn't really imply that the earth is perfect and, a blissful creation. It says humans need to go out and subdue the earth. It's chaotic. Go out and do something about it. The young earth creationists like to jump to Genesis 9, and they say, well, this is the first time humans are given meat. Noah gets off the ark, and God tells Noah, you can eat anything, eat any of the animals you want. Well, the problem is in the English, we add temporal indicators. So we like to translate this as like, well, now you can eat all the animals you want. And prior to that, all you can eat was vegetables. But in the Hebrew, there are no temporal indicators. And scholars like Joshua John Van E, and even early scholars like Philo, noted all that's really happening in Genesis 9 is a restatement of the covenant that happened in Genesis 1. You're being told yet again, yeah, you can eat vegetables and animals. So if it's just a restatement of the covenant in Genesis 1, what we see in Genesis 9, well, then Genesis 1 is probably also implying the same thing. They could also eat animals. If Genesis 9 is just restating what happened in Genesis 1, well, then, yeah, they could eat animals in Genesis 1. That's why the harsh terms are used. You have dominion over these animals. Use them for whatever purposes you need.
Okay. I want to tackle the Romans 8:27 to Romans 8:17 to 33 when it talks about creation. But something that you just said brings a question to my mind, and it's kind of a parenthesis here. If in English and in Spanish there are these kind of translation differences, for example, Genesis 1, now with Noah adding the temporal sense, doesn't that undermine our confidence in our current translations? And then that can have pretty harsh repercussions. Do we trust the story of Jesus? Do we trust the resurrection? I know it's kind of aside the point, but this came up immediately to my mind. If there's so many, I don't know if you call it mistakes or errors in translations, how can we trust the Bible right now on the important matters like salvation and resurrection and all of that?
Well, because for one thing, the scholars I'm citing do not say those things are up at stake. They don't say that those are an issue. So one thing to remember is the Bible was given to the church. It wasn't given to individuals. You know, if all people needed was the Bible, we could just drop them from air raids all over the earth. We don't. We send missionaries to tribes with Bibles because obviously the Bible needs to be understood properly. So we send people who've been trained, who know the Bible, to help guide the people. The Great Commission was given to the church. It was not given to the scriptures. The scripture was given to the church as a tool to help with the Great Commission. So that we need to keep that in mind. So the Bible was never supposed to be divorced from the church. It's supposed to help people read and understand what it's saying. So this is why I'm referring to scholars. They don't say those doctrines are are at stake because of translation issues. In fact, for most of the part, the Bible seems to be translated just fine. It's just some of these other issues have shed better light on how to read things like Genesis and whatnot. So no, I don't see that as a major issue.
Okay. Something to add on that, Antonio? So we can go to the last question. Okay. So going back to the issue of animal death, what about Romans 8, where, and I'm going to read it here, it says, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be set free from its bondage to corruption, and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." And some commentators have said that this particular verse is referring to the fall, and that the creation was subject to the fall at this, to corruption at this point.
Well, I think in one way you kind of answered your own question there. It's commentators who are saying this is referring to the fall. The text doesn't say it refers to the fall. It doesn't say when God subject creation. If you're going to read Genesis 1 in its ancient context, it would have had to happen before, because it says, Genesis 1:28, you need to go out and subdue that chaotic creation that's been subject to fertility. You need to go, Genesis 1:1-3. When God shows up to give creation its proper functions, it's already unproductive and waste. It's already unproductive and has issues. So it had to happen before that if you're going to read this passage in light of Genesis 1. So no, there's no reason to say it has to do with the fall, and Paul doesn't say that.
Okay, good. Well, I don't know, Antonio, do you have any last thoughts on this?
Pues no, pues simplemente comentarios, ¿no? Sobre todo resaltar la importancia y mencionar que todo este tipo de interpretaciones o visiones no son como para proponer algún tipo de novedad, sino simplemente tomar la Biblia en serio. Ajá, no es como con la intención de ser heterodoxo o proponer cosas nuevas, ¿no? Simplemente tomar la Biblia en serio en su contexto y a partir de ello formar una teología más sólida.
Okay, gracias por eso. Michael, it's been a real pleasure to be here with you, learn from you. I know that you have plenty of things that you're doing. Let me just reference to your channel again, Inspiring Philosophy. It's a great channel with great tools. How many subscribers do you have right now?
I believe about 200,000, or at least I'm close to there.
Wow. Yeah. I saw that you published your video on suffering, and I'm way half of it. Before we leave here, any last thoughts, anything that you want our listeners to go with, to think about?
I can't think of anything else. Just a lot of the books I referenced, check those out for more on this. Just don't take my word for it. Go and study this stuff yourself. Joshua John Van Ee's dissertation, Death in the Garden, is a good one. Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, talks about some of this stuff. John Walton's series, The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, are pretty good. J. Richard Middleton's book, The Liberating Image, another good book. So continue to study this stuff. Just don't take my word for it.
And all of these are Hebrew Old Testament scholars, right? It's not just any liberal theologian or liberal evolutionist that is around there, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, Michael, thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.